Hello everyone. This is my first experiment with a screencasting software in which my screen and my video on the corner of the screen can be used along with my voice to explain what I want to explain. And in this case, this is my little pamphlet, or rather a longish pamphlet of 8 or 9 pages that I've been putting out every few weeks, updating it and putting it out for public consumption. Let me run everyone through this particular pamphlet in this first video. The main thing that I want to emphasize to everybody in Australia and elsewhere in the world is that we never had a bigger mountain made out of a smaller molehill. There's never been this level of exaggeration in human history. And, and I've written an article recently which hopefully gets published where I explain how everybody forgot their basic arithmetic, but also all the epidemiologists forgot their basic science. So why do we say this is not a once in a 100-year pandemic? And who says that in the first place? Well, the man who says this is Mr. Scott Morrison. He first said it on the 18th of March. That was in a press conference, and this brochure pamphlet gives a record of gives a link to that particular press conference. But it's not just him; it's virtually everybody, at the top levels, politicians, chief health officers who've been making this claim. So there are two aspects of this, which in my recent conversation with Jay Bhattacharya, he emphasized that particular bit, which came out later in the Great Barrington Declaration. But if you look at this particular bit here in the first part, I've already mentioned it here. The data suggests that the young can go about their business without much concern. They don't have to take any precautions. Those who are between 40 and 60 can probably wear some protective equipment like masks and gloves. At that stage, I thought masks are great. At this stage, I don't think they're very helpful at all. But let's say that's some kind of precautions, extra precautions for people between 40 and 60, and then above 60, people should probably work at home, and anyone with comorbidities, etc. So this is what I wrote on the 28th of February to my bosses, including absolutely senior levels in the Department of Treasury and Finance. I won't go into details here. There'll be a Royal Commission, and we'll get into details there about what people did and what they didn't do with this kind of advice. But the same advice came out through the Great Barrington Declaration in October 2020. So how do we know this is not a once in 100-year pandemic? Because we can do the simple calculation. If it was the Spanish flu, we would have had 220 million people killed by this particular pandemic based on the data from CDS, which is 50 million people killed in 1918 and 19. And so by now it would be 220. How many people died? About 6 now. Let's say Asian flu is 5, Hong Kong flu is 2. So this is probably in the range of the Asian flu or something of the sort. But in reality, it's much less lethal because there's a lot of overcounting, and I've discussed this elsewhere. But we can see clearly from Sweden, for example, 3,000 extra deaths or excess mortality, even though they claimed to have had 10,000 people died from COVID in 2020, which shows that about 1/3, roughly 30%, 35% maybe, died actually from COVID. The others were from other causes and would have died anyway. So back to the issue of this calculation is there in a spreadsheet. You can do it you can check it out yourself. It's a very simple piece of data. Anyone can do this arithmetic. Then we can look at the data from Sweden. The models for Sweden said that by I think it was probably June that they would have this many number of people, the one at the top of the orange bar, and the actual number of people who died in 2020 were this one, which is basically at the end of the year there were practically no difference. If you look at the chart, it's like the average of the last 10 years. And if you look at the death rates, which you look at it here, the death rates per 100,000, they actually were all tapering, and you can see that this is actually less than the average of the past many years. From 1991 onwards, there's been a steady decline in death rates, and the years 2020, 2021, etc. were not particularly exceptional. This, of course, data is from October to September. So you need to keep in mind it's actually the flu season based mortality data. And it's telling us that there's virtually been no pandemic. Nobody can tell us whether there's been a pandemic in Sweden in 20 or 21. Finally, I found this little thing a few weeks ago, which is the UK's official statistics of August 2021 on their Parliament website, which is this one. And it said on 27th August 2021 that the overall infection mortality rate of COVID is approximately 0.096%. This, by the way, is nothing but the same as that of the flu. Now, Jaya Bhattacharya had said it should be around 0.2%. Well, it can be 0.2. It can double the lethality of flu, let's say. But is it the Spanish flu? Absolutely not. Is it this kind of? Is it killing this kind of numbers of people? No, we don't see any data here that has been killing vast numbers of people. So COVID has been a very, very modest pandemic by any standard. We could call it the Hong Kong flu, Asian flu, or something, but nothing to shut the world down for. The other point I wanted to mention quickly here is that lockdowns were known to have never worked in the past. They were used rarely in the past for Ebola and so on. And the data are very clear, they don't work. The WHO's guidelines are also very clear that these kind of things are not to be done. They don't even recommend quarantines and border closures. Forget about lockdowns. That is even for the most extreme virus like a pathogen like Ebola. What about things like ordinary respiratory viruses? Absolutely no. There is no advice for such things. The other paper, there's a paper that Donald Henderson wrote. This is one in 2006, where he basically says the mitigation measures of this sort, such as large-scale quarantines, should be eliminated from serious consideration. We should not even consider them. And there's a lot of literature with Donald Henderson explaining why this is a very bad idea. And of course, Gordon Galea, the WHO's chief in China, said clearly at the beginning itself that trying to contain a city of this sort like Wuhan is new to science. We don't do such things. He said this is certainly not a recommendation of WHO. So lockdowns were never part of the science, okay? And I've explained this in much more detail in my complaint to the International Criminal Court. And you can go through that. And of course, we have people like Stephen Beral, from the Johns Hopkins School, saying he spent a decade on public health training, which is a long time for training, I would say. But he did it. He spent 10 years in training for public health. Or maybe he was training people. And he never gave a lecture on lockdowns to anybody. And of course, there's so much stuff about this, that Henderson basically said the idea that we could intercept people at the borders and then stop the spread of disease is a concept that was antiquated a very long time ago. Basically, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, this was discarded as being a pile of nonsense. And so we had this lockdown. So epidemiologists forgot about their basic science. That's what happened during this pandemic. And so who did the lockdowns? Why did they happen? Well, we know very clearly that this is done from Wuhan in China. And we can see clearly, and I've got evidence here, I won't go into detail, the fake videos and all this other stuff, which is basically that of Xi Jinping. And you can go through this in more detail through my writings, but also, the book Snake Oil by Michael Singer. He's got far more detail if you're interested. We should actually be looking at this kind of information to understand why we're doing what we're doing. So there's an open letter. I've cited that letter. You can go and read that letter, which explains the evidence for the involvement of CCP, in particular Xi Jinping directly. I've actually got a website linked where I've actually shown how Xi Jinping directly claimed to have done this himself. And so we have proof that he was directly responsible. We also have the WHO's report in which they claim that it was Xi Jinping directly who did these lockdowns. So we know who did it. And we also know why he did it, because this is very helpful for him to basically stop, to get a strategic advantage over the West. We know enormous number of proofs. I won't go into details. Vast number of proofs about lockdown harms. There's an enormous amount of harms. Read the book, The Great COVID Panic by Paul Fridges, etc. But also a cost benefit I'm working on with Gigi Foster when she finishes up. She's very busy. Once it's done, and I also provide a relevant feedback to her, that cost benefit analysis will come out and further confirm that even Australia has had a massive amount of harms from lockdowns and virtually no benefits. A recent report came out as well, I think it was John Hopkins, which said that lockdowns probably saved 0.2% of the COVID deaths, 0.2%. So that's the level of inefficacy of these particular measures, and they only cause harm. I want to explain this very briefly. Sunetra Gupta, to me, is one of the most brilliant thinkers, because she explained how international travel essentially helps people to gain immunity from the minor diseases, which then builds immunity for the bigger ones. So if you have a common cold and spread widely across the world, then the next time something of that sort happens, like a coronavirus, which is more lethal, people already have an existing immunity, which has happened in the case of India. They had the cross reactivity, we call it, in virology or immunology, let's say, for the coronavirus. So very few people relatively died in India. So this is something to keep in mind, that international travel is actually very helpful, and by shutting the borders down, we've actually caused enormous harm to Australia's health. The other thing I mentioned in this is the stifling of debate. We know how badly the debate has been stifled in Australia. ABC particularly is the most criminal organization you can imagine. It's so-called bogus false fact check of my work, but completely nonsensical. And that's been the kind of stuff that we've seen in Australia, but also big tech as well. So the debate has been stifled so that people can't even speak these things. The other is quarantines are obviously not required. The WHO clearly said that quarantines of exposed individuals, forget about the ones who are not exposed, even the quarantine of exposed individuals is not recommended under any circumstances. So I won't go into details here. You can read how ridiculous the idea of having a quarantine in Victoria, which obviously couldn't be done properly because it was done so shoddily. The Victorian plan didn't have any of these lockdown quarantine measures, and so naturally it was supposed to be self-isolating at home, etc. if you're sick. But and that's what Sweden did. Sweden actually followed the standard plans. Anyway, so there we are. We basically contact tracing, QR codes, vaccine passports, complete nonsense. We don't want any of that. The PCR test problems, listen to the interview I had with Jay Bhattacharya. He covers these issues very well. And why, PCR tests are simply not suitable for this kind of thing. And of course, masks should not be mandatory. We know that very well. We also know that they don't really work, and that's been, conclusively demonstrated repeatedly by so many pieces of evidence over the last 2 years. COVID death counts are a problem. I explained earlier that only about 1/3 of the COVID deaths can actually be attributed to COVID. The others are probably not, and almost certainly not in at least half of them. And so this basically is the kind of summary of my, and we need a royal commission, which I've got here. So go through this particular pamphlet, guys, and share it around. It contains a lot of useful information. It's very dense, you can try to share it, and hopefully it'll help. And that's all for today's experimental recording, and let's see if this works. Thanks.